We're going to start in about a minute or so. Great, I think we'll begin. Welcome. This meeting is being recorded and it will be posted on our engagement.ca site again today. I'd like to begin this meeting by acknowledging that we are in Mi'kmaq, the ancestral traditional territory of Mi'kmaq. We're going to start with a mayor's message, a little welcome from Mayor Carolyn Bolivar-Getson, and then our manager of planning, Reed Shepherd, will give a presentation. After his presentation, we will take questions. At that time, if you'd like to speak, you can use the raise hand function here in Teams. It's up in the top right corner, or you can put a note in the chat, or if we're missing you because you don't have either of those functions, if maybe you're calling in on the phone, you can literally raise your hand up in front of the camera and I will take a note and call people in order. So when we get to the questions, you can ask one question, we'll answer it, and then if there's more questions, we'll go on to the next person until we've gone through everyone that wants to ask, and then we can come back for second or third questions. This will allow us to ensure that everyone has a chance to speak. You also can drop questions in the chat if you so prefer when we get to the question and answer. And so I'm going to pass it over to Carol. You should be able to unmute yourself, Carolyn.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We are nearing the end of a process that we began in March of 2023. Since that time, staff have heard from hundreds of residents through our online surveys, open houses, and public input. Staff and council members have received hundreds of calls and emails on this issue. We have a responsibility to our residents and to our environment. The new regulations are intended to protect our communities from our coast by keeping activities away from the risks posed by coastal erosion and flooding, and by protecting our sensitive coastal ecosystems from the impacts of activity and development. The proposed regulations strike a balance to permit development where it is safe to do so. Only a few communities in MODL presently have zoning to identify how close structures can be to the coastline or coastal wetlands, or how elevated above sea level new structures must be built. This session today is a public information session where staff will lead us through a short presentation on proposed regulations. After the presentation, Sarah has indicated there will be opportunity for questions. A public hearing will take place following the public information sessions on Thursday, June 13th, which is next week. You can make formal written or oral submissions to council for consideration at the public hearing. Written submissions must be received by 5 p.m. on Tuesday, June 11th. Oral submissions will be received at the hearing. At the hearing, council can make a decision regarding the adoption of the amended municipal planning strategy and the new municipal-wide land use bylaw following the public hearing. We are now setting that date, I believe, to be on Tuesday, June 18th. We appreciate you joining us here to learn more and talk with us. So I will turn it over to Reed. Are you walking us through the presentation? So Reed, if you would.
Great, thank you very much. And I'm just sharing my screen. If someone could give me a thumbs up to let me know that that's coming through. Great, thank you very much. So yeah, I'm just going to do a brief presentation and then of course we can take some more specific questions at the end. Okay, so the information session is geared towards a presentation, question and answer period. The part 3 was a session that we did at the in-person events where people could review maps and ask questions to individual staff. In this case, what we would do would be to kind of point you towards our website. We have an interactive map, so if you're able to get on Teams, you will be able to get on our interactive map, and you can also reach out individually to any of us as well if you have some questions. One of the key things, though, of course, that the mayor mentioned was that in order to receive particular comments about or any views about the proposed regulations, it's important that those either be provided in written form, or if you'd like to say something to council, the opportunity to do that is at that public hearing next week. Today is really only geared towards answering questions. So as the mayor mentioned, there are 2 really primary objectives around the whole project here, in which we're talking about coastal protection. The first being protecting the communities from our coast. So that's human activity and developments, and making sure that those aren't too close to some of the risks to health and safety that are posed by both coastal erosion and coastal flooding. The second piece is around protecting the coastline from us. And that's about protecting the features along our coastlines that do provide things like habitat for different species, and protecting those ecosystems from the impacts of human activity and development. I'm not going to get into each little piece here, but this is more just to show a sense of all of the different pieces that have gone into this work. So the project began over a year ago in the spring of 2023, where council provided direction and passed some motions that directed staff to begin work on this. There was a lot of initial research and consultation with different experts and other governments, such as the provincial government, representatives from the federal government, Dalhousie University, non-governmental organizations, to help inform the data and the science that went into the final regulations that have been drafted. A big part of this has been public engagement as well. So a year ago, there was quite a bit of public engagement. I will get into a little bit more detail on that, but that has led into several discussions and recommendations that have gone to Planning Advisory Committee as well as council, and that has led to the actual draft regulations being drafted and first reading being done on that a couple of weeks ago. So as the mayor mentioned, that these consist of an amended municipal planning strategy as well as a new municipal-wide land use bylaw. So the engagement that was conducted already last year involved a lot of that background research and consultation with experts in order to inform the public that this project was happening. The municipality did a fair amount of advertising and launched a site on what we call our Engage MODL webpage. And so on that website, that page has been live for more than a year, and it contains all of the information and all of the previous documentation, reports. It's the best repository for people who are interested in knowing more about this project and what has happened in the past, and may want to kind of dig into some of the reports and some of the discussions that have happened. All of that is contained on that website. As part of some of the kind of direct reaching out to community members, you can see a picture there. That was one of the meetings. But there were 7 open houses held last spring and summer. There were a couple of pop-ups in various parts of the community. There was a workshop held for community members. All of that was kind of combined into what we're calling a What We Heard report. That's available on our engagement website, and we can also send emails about that as well, of course. But what that report did was summarize the feedback that was gathered from residents around the municipality in terms of kind of some of the numbers that were behind that. The website visits are higher than they show here, but over 2,000 website visits, and in terms of a survey that was asked, that was key to the report in the end, there were 369 different respondents to that. Of course, as you can imagine, anything like this, there are a variety of opinions gathered, views on different subjects. So these are just high-level key takeaways in terms of levels of support for different things. But these this slide outlines what that report contained and where the public kind of felt on some of those issues. So generally, pretty much across the board, community members felt like they had a high level of concern for the issues that were identified that include flooding, erosion, and the protection of sensitive coastal ecosystems. The public desire for the level of regulations was some key questions that were asked to gauge the community's kind of willingness or support for the level of regulation they wanted to see to control or mitigate some of those concerns. And so there was a public desire for, in some cases, a moderate to high level of regulations to deal with those different types of issues. There was support for different types of regulations, so not just one, but across the board. Out of those three issues, flooding, erosion, and ecosystems, the protection of ecosystems was by far the highest in terms of where people wanted to see, they saw that level of concern, and where they were comfortable seeing the highest level of regulation. Public members also identified that education and awareness were really important aspects of this work that were needed to kind of address those issues. The last thing was a strong interest in widespread land use planning issues that kind of go outside the scope of this, but that the community did have a view and concern or wanted to see some additional work on that. Some of the popular issues that came up were around campgrounds or RVs, or things like, public access to coastal areas and beaches. So what we've kind of told people about as part of this work, and we told people last year, was there is another larger project that involves talking to communities about those bigger issues like zoning. And that is in the works. So we will be talking about that again. So please do stay tuned to the work that we're doing. But we did kind of identify that as we did hear this from the public, and we will certainly be talking about that later, but those weren't considered as a part of these regulations. So I'll just start to get into a bit of an overview of what the regulations contain and how they're being addressed. So across the board, in terms of those three kind of areas, erosion, flooding, ecosystems, the general regulations that kind of apply to all of those are about establishing a boundary. So these regulations are focused on the coastal areas. And so there's an extent to which these regulations would apply that does not include rivers such as the LaHave or the Martins or Petite. And then there's some mapping that I'll show you later on that shows kind of where the regulations pertain and where they don't pertain. Another piece is policies that support the education and awareness that people really identified was important in this. And so, if these regulations were to be finalized and approved, there would be some work around making sure community understands what the implications are, as well as talking about the larger issues of flooding, erosion, and protection of ecosystems. The last piece that applies to all of them is around reviewing these policies more frequently than normally would be done with these types of documents. Planning policy documents are required to be reviewed every 10 years at a minimum. But in this case, council wanted to make sure to do that after 5 years so that we can relook at the information that was put and check and see are these addressing the issues that they were intended to address? Is there any new information out there that may help update these as well? So the next thing I'm going to do is go through those three topic areas. And the first one is around coastal flooding. So I'll just start out by saying each of these three topic areas really involve the primary regulation in each of these involves a setback, a distance away from something. And so that's the primary regulation tool that's being used for each of these. Around that, there are different rules and exceptions and different things like that. But if we start with coastal flooding, the regulations involve elevating structures up to avoid the risk of flooding. And so what this particular regulation involves is for areas of new homes that are built, the space in those homes that is habitable. So that means not a deck or not an unfinished basement or not a garage, but those other parts of a home, like a kitchen or a bathroom or a bedroom, those are the type parts of a home that would need to be meeting this higher elevation requirement. And the elevation requirement is 3.97 meters above what is approximately mean sea level or average sea level. So it's not high tide, it's not the high water mark, it's actually a lower point, which is generally representative of mean sea level. In terms of how that is actually measured, a surveyor has instruments that they use to accurately project up in elevation about how high that needs to be located. And so again, this is really only pertaining to habitable spaces in new residential buildings. Another piece of this is a more stringent requirement for institutional uses. So new institutional uses like schools, hospitals, long-term care facilities, those would be prohibited in any of the areas that may be at risk of flooding. So we have maps that we'll show in a couple of minutes that this regulation pertains to the areas that are at highest risk of flooding. Areas that are below this 3.97 meters and are shown on that map, those are areas where these new institutional uses would be prohibited. They can't just be elevated, they actually need to be located outside of that area. And that's because those types of uses are considered higher risk populations, and therefore just elevating them is not wouldn't be seen as enough of a safety net. So those are actually better located outside of flood risk areas entirely. There are other types of uses on the coastline besides homes. So those could include things like commercial uses, industrial uses, marine uses. Those are not subject to these requirements. So new retail or restaurant, those types of things do not need to follow this elevation requirement. There are a lot of people who have existing homes on the coastline and are wondering, what can I do with my existing home? How do these rules apply to that? Anything that's there today would be considered grandfathered in. There's also an exemption for additions to those existing structures. So there's an allowance to do a fairly large addition to a building or a home that is there without having to make that new portion of the home elevated. Having said that, providing the information is part of the education and awareness is giving people the tools that if they wanted to put the new part of the home at an elevation, they're certainly welcome to, and now we have the information to help them make that decision. But there is an allowance to recognize that when someone's doing an addition to an existing home, it may be a bit challenging to make one portion of that addition higher than the older part of the home. The next part of these kind of larger regulation pieces is around addressing the issue of coastal erosion. So of course, as we know, coastal erosion is the kind of impact that we're seeing along our coastlines where the waves and waves, particularly in storm events, cause the land to erode away, like we're seeing in this photo on the slide here. And so the best tool as part of our work that we identified was really just to require that new development be located further back and away from that area, away from that risk area. So this involves kind of two pieces. The first one is about identifying a 30-meter or 100-foot area along the coastline that new development needs to be outside of. As a part of that 30 meters, there is also a 15-meter or 50-foot area along the coast, and that needs to be maintained with natural vegetation. So it'll be the natural vegetation that's growing in the area. And what that does is help do a couple of things. One is around habitat, and that's the habitat, and it's a critical area for habitat that's along the coastline. And so it's partly addressing the protection of ecosystems, but there's another advantage where that vegetation, where it occurs naturally, can help prevent erosion, protect those exposed areas along our coastlines. Now, having said that, our coastline is very diverse as well. So we know there are portions of the coast that don't have a real issue with erosion. There are areas of exposed bedrock on our coastline, and in cases where residents may want to be able to build a bit closer, and where they feel that the erosion is not as much of a risk, this does provide also an ability to do a study where that study, if it shows that the erosion risk is low, they could reduce that 30-meter setback down to as little as 15 meters, because that's where that vegetative buffer requirement is. So there's a flexibility that's built in there in cases where the erosion risk really isn't as great. Now, of course, people that are in high risk erosion areas, doing that study, may not provide them the answer that they want. And so in those cases, the study may show that they need to still be located at outside the 30 meters. Similar to the last regulation, this one also allows for some exemptions for specific things that do need to be located close to the water. So those are things like those industries, such as marine-related things that need to be located right by the water, can be and can continue to be located in those areas because of the nature of their work or of the operation that they do. The last piece that I'll mention is for those folks that have an existing structure, or existing home that may be within this erosion risk area, they can continue to add on to their home, but it does need to be away from the risk area. So we're not talking about decks here, we're talking about livable space and things like that. Those additions can't be located closer to the water, they need to be located further away from the water. Last piece here is around addressing the concern and the issue that people have identified as part of this in protection of coastal ecosystems. And so what's being proposed here in terms of regulations is really utilizing the provincial wetland map. So the province has an inventory of wetlands that they've identified, and this establishes a setback and vegetative buffer around those wetlands, and that helps to keep the habitat and protect the quality of the water that's in those wetlands, as well as the habitat that exists there for the important kind of functions that those wetlands provide. And by keeping development away from wetlands, it's further kind of adding that layer of protection that they don't currently have. The policies that are as part of this piece involve collaboration and recognizing that there's important nonprofit groups and different organizations, particularly in the local area, that have expertise and involved with protection of wetlands. And so continuing to working with them to strengthen and help look at some of the wetlands that are out there. One of the pieces that this next bullet really identifies is that the provincial wetland mapping is a starting point, and we know that there are cases where that mapping isn't as accurate as it could be, and so there are cases where it doesn't catch all of the wetlands that are there on the ground, and there are other cases where it identifies a wetland isn't there or isn't in that part of that area. And so the regulations here use a similar approach that we have in some of our planned areas to allow some flexibility to adjust the mapping when there is not in fact a wetland present, and to not be too much of a burden for people to make a change to that map to continue to do what they need to do on their property when there really is not a wetland actually there. So that's an overview of the regulations. What I'll do here is just kind of walk through a couple of how our interactive map works. And so on our engage.modl.ca webpage, we have our coastal protection site. On that site, there's a link. You can open up an interactive map. And what this map does is it's the same thing that we look at on our end here, but it identifies all of those wetlands that I talked about that are contained within this these regulations. It identifies the area approximately along the coast where the erosion, that 30-meter erosion risk area applies, as well as the 15-meter vegetative buffer. And it also accurately shows the areas that are below the 3.97 meters in elevation. So those are the areas that are deemed to be more at risk of coastal flooding, and where those habitable spaces would need to be elevated in the future. So just to walk through those layers, the first one here is showing us where the regulations themselves apply. So there's a lot of areas on the coastline that have no zoning in place. So the process where people can do development involves coming in and getting a building permit and doing building on their property. There are other areas where there is zoning in place. So what happens in those areas is people come in and get a development permit first, and that involves the development permit is aimed to make sure that the development meets whatever zoning regulations are in place. So this basically establishes that same process along the entire coastline. In the areas that don't already have a permit requirement, that now would be required where there is no zoning, such as areas more down around Petite and the shore along those areas, Riverport and those areas further closer up to Chester. A lot of those pockets have some zoning already in place. This is just establishing that same process for people that are on the other side of the Lehave, and to introduce that new process. This is showing areas where the permits are now required, not necessarily showing us where the specific regulations might impact people, but this is where you need to get a permit. What that then allows us to do is to then look more closely at our mapping to see, is the development going to be, is it proposed in an area where it's a coastal flood risk area? And if so, maybe there's a requirement to elevate some of the structure itself. Maybe it's a use that is not habitable, such as a garage or an outbuilding or something. And in that case, it would just be a check here to say, okay, this is what it is, and proceed on your way. This next piece is showing us kind of what that erosion risk area and vegetative buffer might look like. And of course, if somebody wanted to build within these areas, it would be looking at did they get maybe a risk assessment study, or they're not interested in doing that, and there's room to build outside of this. It's just making sure that they're building outside of this 30-meter area. The one key thing that we've talked about here is it being generalized, and it's not as accurate. And that's because a coastal erosion risk area is measured from the top of the bank on a property back. And so we don't have, as we all know, our shorelines change so much every year. We don't have an accurate idea of where that edge of that bank is from our mapping. So this is why it's saying generalized. The way that would be measured out is to, on each property specific, it's the top of the bank back. If it's a very low lying property that might be sandy or things like that, and not really have a clear delineation between the top of the bank and the bank itself, the high watermark would be used. The last piece is to show kind of what those wetland protection layers look like. So the solid green is showing us where there's an existing provincial wetland that's been mapped, and this is applying that new 30-meter setback and vegetative buffer around the edge of that. And so that's helping us make sure that development is not occurring too close to that wetland. And so this is the kind of tool that we'll be using to indicate whether that's the case. So that's the map. In terms of next steps, so we've done some in-person sessions in Riverport and LaHave and Tancook. This virtual meeting is the last kind of opportunity to do a kind of a live thing. As the mayor mentioned, we've talked about before, the public hearing is the official formal process for people who'd like to come and speak directly about this issue next week in council chambers. There's information on our website about that, but there's some times there. What I'll mention too is that it's been scheduled to make sure there's lots of time for people to speak. And so in doing that, there's a schedule in the afternoon that starts at 4. There will be a break during that period for supper, and then there's a second session that will start again at 7. You don't have to come to both. You can come to one, but it's geared towards making it flexible for people who may be working during the day. Following the public hearing, council can do second reading, which is the official kind of adoption by council, where they would consider all the things that they heard from the public hearing and and any written responses that people have provided, and make an official decision on moving forward with these regulations. So this is my last slide here, and it's just around kind of if you have questions, if you have specific stuff that you want to reach out to us about, you can submit written official comments on your views. You can submit those anytime. We have that planning@modl.ca web or email address, and then we have the opportunity to speak in person. You can also, of course, contact your local councillor as well, kind of in the time leading up to next Thursday. So maybe I'll turn it back over to Sarah. I think if we can take questions, she might be able to facilitate that. And then, of course, we can, on the planning team, answer questions as well.
Great. So as I said before, if you have questions, you can use the raise hand function in here if you know how to use it. Otherwise, you can unmute yourself, wave your hand. We'll do our best to try to have some semblance of order. It can be tough. Any questions today? Looks like I have Martin Broadman. Go ahead, Martin.
Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for the presentation from staff, and thank you to council for participation today. Can you hear me first of all?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Perfect. Great. Perfect. The coastal line, so excluding rivers, so this has nothing to do with any lakes?
That's correct. That's correct. Yeah.
Okay, that was my first question. Now, when we go, can council ensure that, let's say, grandfathered properties which follow under this Coastal Protection Act can be insured to an affordable price in the future? Can that be guaranteed, or was there any consultation with insurance companies when this law or these regulations take place, that the insurance companies cannot really say, no, we won't or can't insure that anymore?
We've had that question come up a couple of times over the past few years around how does insurance work when it comes to things like areas that are at risk of flooding or other areas. And in some of those discussions with insurance industry folks, what we've come to understand is that they don't look at individual municipal, bylaws and what the status of those are. They do their own mapping. As you can imagine, insurance companies are very risk averse, and they're not waiting for municipalities like MODL to implement zoning to turn down people for insurance. So what they do is they have their own mapping system, and they make decisions about different things like flood risk or fire risk, erosion, all kinds of things based on their own mapping. So what they've told us is basically that, we've got our own data, we're relying on that, and we're not waiting for municipalities to introduce regulations, because as we all know, they're quite risk averse, and they they don't have any problem, telling people what they can and cannot do.
So, but then it would be fair to say that there's a risk that properties like this could not be insured or could be insured to a much higher premium. I think that's fair to say, because regulations would enhance the insurance, let's say, policies internally with such a zoning. I think we can conclude that from that in that case.
I guess what I can say is that they've told us what they do is they do their own research, and they may have their own flood map that shows how much things are at risk, and they'll make their own decisions based on that, not based on the municipality's mapping.
Okay. Let's say we have properties along roadways, provincial roadways. I think in the model we have 11 kilometers of MODL roadways. Provincial roadways which go along the coastal area, where we have land, let's say, in between the roadways and the coast, let's say with less than 60 meters, which today would be a building lot, which no further could be a building lot, I think, under the new regulations. How much property, or did you guys make an assessment of how much the valuation we could see for such homeowners or lot owners?
What we did do as part of this is look at the number of lots that would be potentially, impacted by the new regulation. So in some cases, it's because they're very, very close to the coastline, and maybe other cases where they're close to a wetland. We also applied some different filters to that, because there's a lot of, or I shouldn't say there's a lot, but there are some very small slivers of land out there as well that are very likely to be undevelopable as is. And so we applied a bit of a filter to that. So we put in some parameters around, a size of lot minimum, and that would be, required to fit in this category. We identified 111 properties that would potentially be impacted, like what you're saying, and be in this situation. But some of those still may be, very long and narrow and very challenging to develop, despite, maybe being a large property, but it may be very long and narrow and very challenging to build on anyway. And in terms of evaluation, the market really is the kind of the determining factor in that. And when people have questions about how properties are valued or what the process is involved, we often ask them to reach out to Property Valuation Services Corporation, because they're best able to kind of talk to what happens when the property values are assigned, and how the process works.
Okay, and my last question was actually in regards to the liability. Did council sort of maybe evaluated what kind of a liability potentially could arise from such properties, or in general even structures which exist, which cannot be added on easily anymore, I understand, because any new structures have to go to the setback, so it could be not part, I think, of the main dwelling, I believe. Correct me when I'm wrong. So when yes, did you guys maybe outline the budget for such liabilities, so the taxpayers could see what could arise here in legal costs?
We have heard some concerns about that when we've talked to the public. I guess the best way to answer that is that municipalities are not just optionally introducing land use regulations, but there are mandatory minimum planning regulations that the province has introduced, that there's no getting around doing that. The municipality, the District of Lunenburg, is one of the few municipalities in the province that does not have mandatory minimum planning in place. So the areas that don't have zoning, the province is requiring that those areas address the minimum requirements that they've outlined under the Municipal Government Act. And some of that includes addressing, areas that are at high risk of things like coastal flooding. And so it's not necessarily a question of is it something that the municipality is going to get pushback on, but it's actually a mandatory minimum. The province is saying that needs to be done. And in fact, it's a requirement that the municipality meet the province's requirements. And the kind of what the municipalities can do and what they're required to do is really clearly outlined in the Municipal Government Act. That kind of outlines what municipal jurisdiction is and what their roles and responsibilities are.
Right, but didn't the province exited the Coastal Protection Act because of the liability issue?
I couldn't answer, about exactly why the province didn't move forward with the Coastal Protection Act. They did introduce a Coastal Protection Action Plan, and that introduced some mapping and some other initiatives, including some funding to help homeowners navigate, areas that are at high risk. But one of the things they've done as a part of that work is really highly encourage municipalities to do the types of works that the District of Lunenburg is doing with this. So the province has on several occasions kind of pointed out the District of Lunenburg for moving ahead with, local regulations. I think the province has talked about the province being, really unique, and that each municipality is better suited to do this at the local level. So they have introduced some initiatives as a part of that action plan that are helping municipalities do the work to support that plan and put the regulations in at the local level.
So at MODL
So,
would be.
Martin, I'm actually just gonna stop you right there and see if I have anyone else who'd like to ask a
Yeah,
question.
no, that's fine.
And then we can come back for sure.
That's fine. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. I have Kimberly Landry. You can unmute yourself. Can't hear you yet, Kimberly. And we can't hear you yet. Do you want to try unmuting yourself again?
Hello, sorry
Very
about
good.
that.
We can hear you now.
Hey, sorry about that. I didn't see the button
Okay.
at the top. Hi, my name is Kimberly Landry. I own a coastal property in East LaHave. I followed the process and I commend MODL in taking action to protect our coastlines and the people that live along our shores. Thank you, council and staff, for all your efforts to inform and engage the public during this process. I had the chance to study both the MLDL mapping and the recent mapping released by the province of Nova Scotia. Both maps, to me, seem to overlap with very little difference. They both indicate significant flood and erosion in tidal rivers and estuaries like the LaHave, both in the present and future threat to hundreds of homes in these rivers. My specific question surrounds the geographic lines drawn to eliminate rivers from the mapping, excluding the same protection and regulation for properties that is afforded to open ocean properties. What rationale and scientific data supports this decision?
I can speak to that. I guess there was, as anyone can kind of look through our Engage MODL website. So there was some initial recommendations and discussions that have occurred, over time. And so some of that was the evolution of kind of how things began in terms of what recommendations look like at the beginning, and then considering what direction council wanted to go in and at a later date. And so the direction that council provided as a part of that process was to look at just the coastline for now. And so the lines were drawn to look, and we did look specifically at, where would be the kind of locations that would be the most logical at the entrance to those river systems to draw the line at this point. But in terms of kind of moving forward, as I mentioned, that there's a 5-year review cycle, And then there's, of course, a larger MODL 2040 zoning project. Both of those are opportunities for, that are going to have to look more broadly at planning issues. And, that's something that could be revisited by council for sure if they choose to do so.
Okay. I myself have experienced significant damage, both in Fiona and after the storm surge that happened that year. One could say that tidal rivers could experience, given the right conditions, could experience more damage and more risk than what would be to open ocean. So again, I go back to what is the justification for eliminating properties that have been deemed to be at risk by both the MLDL initial mapping and the provincial mapping. If I look at my home and I see both of the mapping, I see my home is underwater unless I take action to protect myself, as is the properties on both sides of me. So I guess I'm asking council to take another look at this question, because I know from myself, from neighbors and friends on both sides of the Lehave, that we experience flood damage and that we do experience significant erosion. So I think this decision is leaving hundreds of homes at risk, and I would ask council to take another look at this perhaps.
Just on that point, and if anyone else has any, specific points they'd like to raise, I would encourage you, in addition to raising it here, to reaching out with written comments, coming to the public hearing as well, just for the fact that we're not kind of taking notes in an official capacity as part of this process, so that if you'd like council to consider things like that, and if there's any other points that people would like to bring forward, it's important that you raise them with your councillor through a written submission and or by coming to the public hearing, which is kind of the official opportunity to do that.
Thank you very much, Reid. I appreciate you articulating that, and I think I represent a group of people that have articulated that, put it in a letter to council, and we'll follow up before the public hearing.
Sarah, you're on mute.
Sorry, is there anyone else who'd like to speak? Heather, feel free, we'll let you unmute yourself. I'll tell you when I can hear you.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. I had a question that really hasn't come up at all, but has been in my mind a bit since the Coastal Protection Act was proclaimed and then rejected. And that's about septic systems along the coast in the coastal risk area. Someone, in my mind, could build out of the risk area, but there's septic bed in the risk area. Is there any regulation or permit that would look at that situation?
You're right that I don't think that has come up, but it is an important point, I think, to clarify. There are some different jurisdictions that are involved with approval of developments, and in this case, Department of Environment, Provincial Department of Environment is the approval authority for septic systems, and so the municipalities don't have the authority to regulate the placement of septic systems through our land use bylaw. However, the province, at least, and this is, I don't want to speak on their behalf, but their typical regulations for a typical system do require that it's set back at least 100 feet or 30 meters from a water body. So in most cases that should be actually lining up well with these regulations. So both the system and the home would need to be set back. but I don't know for sure whether there may be certain exemptions that may apply to that regulation. There's different types of septic systems, some that have a higher level of treatment in cases where people are very constrained on their properties. So I wouldn't want to say that outright it's always 100 feet or 30 meters, but Department of Environment is very much the authority over septic systems on properties.
Carolyn, you had your hand up?
I do, just for clarification, because I believe, Reed, you said that written submissions should go to your counselor. And I believe that they should go by email to planning@modl.ca or by mail to April Wynot Lonas.
Yes.
Is where they should go, just for clarification there, so people do have the avenue, and that, again, it would be to planning@modl.ca or by mail to April Wynot Lonas at the office here in the address.
Yeah, thank you for clarifying that. And I just put the planning@modl email address in the chat. If anybody wants to copy that, they can feel free.
Do I have anyone else who'd like to ask any questions? Going once? Martin, did you have any follow-up questions you wanted to ask?
Really, I was actually finished before, but the point was raised, the scientific point was raised, and I think that's an important factor. It seems to me all these elements are based mainly on models. When we look back 100 years and look at Lunenburg as example, I think one of the oldest buildings in Lunenburg is the Himmelmann Wharf. And I can look at pictures 100 years ago or so, and I look at them today, and really I can't see much difference. So do we have other elements to consider? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I'm not denying that. But the scientific aspect and the models, in my opinion, don't line up, but that's my opinion. And but it's fair to say that they are based on models, I believe. And that's all I can say right now.
Great, thank you. One last chance for questions before we close this out. Okay, well, thank you very much for joining us today. As we said, oh, Kimberly, did you have a quick question? Right in under the wire?
Yes. Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Great. Just going back to Reed, when you made a comment previously that council wanted to go another way as far as the mapping, and that they were going to just address the coastline for now. What does for now mean?
I can't, yeah, I can't speak on behalf of council. So in terms of kind of decisions that they've made, it's your best, approaching them with that question directly. I say for now only because these regulations, like any land use regulations, can change in the future, and so they're always open to future changes, future additions or subtractions. And so it's not something that has to stay static for a long time. It is a requirement that these be updated, and in that part of that update process, there's always an engagement element to that. And so, in that 5-year window or before, as part of other work, there's certainly going to be opportunities to weigh in on issues like that.
Okay. Yeah, it just it's a little confusing to me when I look at the mapping. The properties in Rose Bay that are exposed to open ocean, and the properties that surround myself and other areas close to me are exactly the same. So the same risk area. And yeah, so I just want to be able to understand that more and understand how MLGL has arrived at this decision. But thank you very much for your answer.
Okay, thank you. Okay, we're gonna end this and feel free to submit your written responses, written comments, and again, hopefully we'll see some of you out next Thursday afternoon. Have a good day.
Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Reed.
Thank you.
Thank you.